All right, welcome to section 1.4 of Introduction to Criminal Justice. Today we're going to talk about the change in the criminal justice system in recent American history. Okay, so there have been different periods where the criminal justice system, for one reason or another, has changed very drastically, very quickly. And today we're going to talk about just a small handful of those, because there are a lot of them. But I picked out a few that were kind of the most important, and the most important kind of things for you as a student to kind of put into historical context and to be able to understand like how the things you're learning about in those other classes are really impacting the stuff you're learning in these classes. Okay, so the first one is the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, you could say it really started directly after the Civil War, or even before the Civil War, right? So 1865, we passed the 13th Amendment, no more slavery, but a lot of the governments, especially in the South, but all over the country, start passing these laws that are commonly referred to as Jim Crow laws. And I have no idea whether Jim Crow was an actual person or what, but these laws got named Jim Crow laws. And these were laws that were very racist without usually actually naming race. Okay? And I'll give you an example. So shortly after the Civil War, a lot of cities and states, especially in the South, but across the country, start passing laws about how if you want to vote, you have to pass kind of a citizenship test kind of thing, right? Where they ask you a whole bunch of questions about, how long does a representative serve for? How long does a senator serve for? What year was the Constitution ratified? And all these things. And it became this really complex, really difficult to pass test. And so, of course, rich people who've had a good education, people who went through school, were able to pass these tests and they were able to vote. But poor people usually couldn't pass these tests. They hadn't had the schooling. They didn't know about, they couldn't read, right? So they weren't able to pass those tests. But as part of those laws, they said, look, if your grandfather could vote, you don't have to pass this test. If you can show us proof that your grandfather could vote, you can just skip the test, right? Now, if you're poor and white and you can't pass that test, no big deal. You go find your grandfather, either have him or some document or something that shows, yeah, my grandfather could vote, no problem. But poor black people, could their grandfathers vote? Of course not. Their grandfathers were slaves. So it was a way to keep African Americans from voting by using a law that didn't actually mention race at all, right? And there were tons of these different Jim Crow laws about where you could eat, where you could sleep, like all these things that were either overtly or covertly racist, okay? But then the Civil Rights Movement really picked up steam in the 50s and early 60s, okay? There was a huge Supreme Court case called Brown v. Board of Education. Now, prior to Brown v. Board of Education, there was a legal philosophy that you could have separate facilities for each race as long as they were equal, right? So if you were a police department, you could have the black cell and you could have the white cell as long as those were equal. Now, in practice, were they ever equal? No. They were never actually equal, okay? The white cells were always much nicer than the black cells. The white hotel rooms and hospital rooms and diners were always way nicer than the ones set aside for African Americans. So Brown v. Board of Education comes up, and it's specifically about education. It's about segregation in public schools. But really the decision applied much more broadly to that. But basically the famous line in Brown v. Board of Education is, separate but equal is inherently unequal, right? So the fact that we had separate but equal schools for black students and white students is inherently unequal. You have to start integrating your schools, and by extension, you have to start integrating your hotels and your restaurants and your police stations and all these things. And that caused a lot of strife. It caused a lot of strife. There were a lot of people, again, especially in the South, but all over the country, who were really, really, really upset by this. And it became this huge kind of flashpoint in the country and the society and our culture. So in mid-1960s, I want to say it was 1965, but it could have been 66 or 64, somewhere in there, they passed the Civil Rights Act, which essentially was a federal law that came down and said, look, states aren't allowed to discriminate anymore. You're not allowed to discriminate in restaurants or hotels or any of those things. But it also had a very big impact on criminal justice, right? Because now we could no longer discriminate in our criminal justice system overtly. Okay, there's still a lot of disparate racial impact in the criminal justice system, but the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement really helped a lot in attempting to make the system a little more equal for people of all races. So it was a very, very important thing, important moment, important movement. Still is. Second period I want to talk about is Vietnam, right? The Vietnam War. I'm sure we've all seen the old movies and stuff about Vietnam. And Vietnam was a very, very, very unpopular war. It was the last war in the United States where we used the draft. Okay, the draft is where they would take young men from 18 to I think 30, or I don't remember what the upper age limit was, but you could be conscripted against your will to go fight for the U.S. military in this war. And that really, really upset a lot of people, because not only did they think that the war itself was immoral, but they also saw the draft especially as immoral. Making young men go off and fight in a war they didn't want to fight in was something that upset a lot of people. So they had a lot of protests. Protests everywhere. Similar to the Civil Rights Movement. Civil Rights Movement had protests all over the place. And with both those groups, both the Civil Rights protesters and the Vietnam War protesters, the police reacted in probably the worst way possible. Okay? What they should have done is just let them protest, right? Let them wave their signs and do all their things. But what the police did instead was they would do things like use police dogs to bite protesters. They would turn fire hoses from the fire department on the protesters. They would arrest people, pepper spray people, do all these things that really gave more weight and more media attention and more focus to the protesters than if they had just sat there and, made sure nobody got hurt, right? And this really came to a head. The biggest kind of mess up by the government in their policing role for these protests came at Kent State. Okay, Kent State's a university up in the Midwest somewhere, and they were having a large Vietnam War protest. And instead of calling out the police to kind of contain this protest, they called out the National Guard. It was actually the military showed up with the rifles and the whole nine. And so the protest is going on, the military's there, and nobody's really quite sure how it happened, but somehow the military ended up firing their rifles into this big group of protesters. And they killed 4 people. And this became this huge moment in American culture and American society. We saw, it was kind of, there's a famous photograph of a student lying dead and a young woman kneeling next to him just wailing. It's this black and white photograph, and it's incredibly kind of poignant and soul-touching, and it kind of came to illustrate the government misusing its policing function, right? It went too far. It did too much, and it was too violent in attempting to police its citizens. And that photograph became very famous, and it became this huge rallying cry for the Vietnam War protesters and the Civil Rights protesters and all these other groups who were active in the 60s and 70s. And it made police kind of look at themselves and say, okay, look, we are doing this wrong. What can we do to change how we react to people, especially protesters, but even non-protesters, even just members of the public? How can we do our job better? And that really had a big impact on the system as a whole. Third time period I want to talk about is kind of, this one is a very wide time period, okay? So starting in the 60s, but going up through the early 90s, there was the war on crime. Okay, so our president in the 60s, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the first and only president from Texas, because George W. Bush doesn't count, he's from Connecticut. LBJ, he started the war on crime, right? So he started seeing in the 1960s, crime's getting worse, crime's getting worse, crime's getting worse. What do we do? What do we do? So he started working with Congress and working with the judiciary, and they started trying all these different programs and different laws and different this and different that. And the war on crime really went from the 60s up through the early 90s, but it kept getting worse. No matter what they did, it kept getting worse, kept getting worse, kept getting worse. But one of the things they did, back long before I was born, long before probably most of you were born, was the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. Okay, this had a huge impact on the criminal justice academic system, especially because one of the things that this law did was it gave money to this group called the LEAA, and they used that money to send police officers to school, to universities, right? Now, that money had to be used in some way to improve the schooling or improve the job capabilities of the people going to school. So for lawyers and stuff, that's fairly obvious. More law school or JDs and all this stuff. But for police officers, they went to universities and said, "Hey, can we major in policing?" Universities were like, "We have criminology," which at the time was a small subset of sociology. And they were like, all right, close enough. And so it was that giant influx of people wanting to take criminology courses that caused criminology and later criminal justice to split off as its own academic discipline. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. So the fourth and last period of change I want to talk about is September 11th. September 11th, 2001. Anybody who is over the age of probably 5 years old will be able to tell you a story about exactly where they were and exactly what they were doing when 9/11 happened. I might have the most boring story of all. I slept through the whole thing. I had gone to sleep very late the night before. I didn't have class until 1 or 2 in the afternoon the next day. And I slept through the whole thing. And by the time I woke up, it was all over. The towers had all fallen. But that day really impacted Americans, and it impacted our government, it impacted our criminal justice system, it impacted every single facet of American life. If you're not old enough to really remember pre-9/11, I cannot emphasize enough how much 9/11 really changed America. And I think every generation kind of has that moment, right? For me and my generation, it was 9/11. For our parents' generation, it was the Kennedy assassination, right? That was a huge moment. For their parents' generation, it was Pearl Harbor, right? So every generation kind of has this really big, gigantic, world-changing moment. And 9/11 was my generation's. The bad news about 9/11, obviously, the bad news is lots of people died. But the other bad news is that America, as its reaction to 9/11, kind of lost its damn mind. There were, in a lot of ways, we completely and totally overreacted. airports for a long time, they've calmed down since, but for a long time they were just absolute monsters of the illusion of security, right? It wasn't actual security. When they tested the security at airports, they would always fail. But man, they made it look like they had some really tough security, and that became just a giant headache for everyone. But there were two big changes to the criminal justice system, two formal changes that really did change the criminal justice system a lot. The first of those is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, so in the federal government, they have different departments, and each one is headed up by essentially a secretary, right? So we have the Department of Defense in the federal government, which has the military underneath it, right? And that's headed by the Secretary of Defense. We have the Department of Justice at the federal level, which is headed by the Attorney General, right? We have the Department of Consumer Affairs and the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of the Interior and all these things, and each one has a head. And for the first time in a long time, I can't even remember when prior to September 11th, when the previous new federal department got created. But under George W. Bush, he created the Department of Homeland Security and created the Secretary of Homeland Security. One of the problems with 9/11, one of the reasons that 9/11 was able to happen, was that we had all these different law enforcement groups, and each one kind of had a piece of the puzzle, and it had a little bit of the information that would have shown that these guys were about to hijack planes and slam them into buildings. But because these different law enforcement agencies didn't communicate with each other very well, they weren't able to put those pieces together and figure out what was about to happen. We had enough information to stop it, but each group that had a little piece of that information they didn't share well. So Bush created the Department of Homeland Security and then proceeded to put basically all of the federal law enforcement groups into that Department of Homeland Security with one director and one mission and one kind of grouping in an effort to kind of make sure that they communicate better with each other, right? So the FBI can talk to the DEA, which can talk to the Secret Service, which can talk to Customs and Border Protection, and they have an easier time working together in order to try to make sure that that doesn't happen again. If the different pieces are spread amongst these different groups, they need to be able to come together, put those pieces together, and see the full picture before the next 9/11 happens, right? So that was a very, very big deal, this creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Another big thing, obviously, the war on terror, right? We got really, really terrified of terrorism. We really didn't want another 9/11 to happen. And that caused a huge shift in how we do even domestic policing. It caused, there was the USA Patriot Act, which caused a lot of strife because it was seen as giving law enforcement a lot more surveillance power on American citizens, and people were very, very afraid that that would be misused and that would be an infringement on the due process rights of American citizens. But we got law enforcement especially got a whole lot of money for anti-terrorism efforts. And obviously how well that money was spent and the actual outcomes of spending all that money are very much up for debate. And there are a lot of people who say, oh, we haven't had another 9/11 since, so thus we're doing a great job. And there are other people who say, we wasted all that money. Like our police are getting more and more into this mission that they really shouldn't. Our police aren't there to fight terrorism. Our police are there to serve its citizens, right? And so there's this big debate on the war on terror and what we've done in our responses and whether they were the right responses, the wrong responses, or what. But I don't think anybody can deny that September 11th had a giant, monumental impact on the American criminal justice system. Okay? So we're almost done with this section. So I just want to add, I got this slide and one more slide, but I want to talk a little bit about the 14th Amendment. Okay, the 14th Amendment might be the most important of all 27 amendments to the United States Constitution. The 14th Amendment's a long one, so I'm not gonna read the whole thing, but there is one part of the 14th Amendment which says something along the lines of, no citizen shall be denied due process of the law. Now, in the post-Civil War period, when the 14th Amendment was passed, that meant basically you can't treat slaves or former slaves differently than you treat any other citizen, right? We need to make sure they are facing the due process that they're entitled to as human beings, right? But back in the day, both the 14th Amendment and all of the other amendments to the Constitution, the Second Amendment that, right to bear arms, the Fourth Amendment, right to be protected from searches and seizures, the Fifth Amendment, right to remain silent, First Amendment, right to freedom of speech, all of those only prevented action by the federal government. State and local governments, as long as it didn't violate the state constitution, could violate those rights all they wanted. None of those Bill of Rights that we all love so much applied or prevented any state or local government agency from doing anything they wanted. It only applied to the federal government. Until there were some court cases starting in the early 20th century, and we'll talk more specifically about these in section 2 or 3, until the Supreme Court started saying no. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment says no citizen shall be denied due process of law. We take that to mean that not only does the Fourth Amendment restrict unreasonable searches and seizures by the federal government, but it restricts unreasonable searches and seizures from any layer of government. So, because of this court case, we're going to say that the Fourth Amendment applies not just to the federal government, but to any level of government, and nobody is allowed to violate your Fourth Amendment rights. Now, this process is called incorporation. Okay? All of the first 10 amendments, or most of the first 10 amendments, I should say, have since, in part of the 20th century, or even the 21st century, been incorporated to the states. Meaning now, not only do you have the freedom of speech which protects you from retaliation by the federal government, but you also have the freedom of speech which protects you from retaliation by the state and local governments, because that part of the First Amendment was incorporated to the states by the Supreme Court using and with justification of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay? That is a very important process. We're going to talk more about that later in the semester. But it is a very, very, very important thing. And that 14th Amendment Due Process Clause and the incorporation that's happened because of it has had a huge impact on how policing and the court systems and all those things happen, both at the state and local level, not just the federal level. Okay? Another thing I want to say is that the Supreme Court, the justices are appointed by the president. And the president is either, essentially, over the last 150 years, has been either a Republican or a Democrat. Now, technically, the Supreme Court justices are not supposed to be partisan. They're not supposed to be Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or Greens or any other party. But in practice, Republicans appoint conservative justices, Democrats tend to appoint more liberal justices, and you can tell a lot about how any certain Supreme Court justice is going to rule based on the party that appointed them. Right now, as I am recording this video, we have 5 Supreme Court justices appointed by Republicans and 4 Supreme Court justices appointed by Democrats. So this, even not knowing what cases they're going to take up next year, I can fairly safely assume that they're going to tilt in a slightly more conservative stance than some courts in history have done. And this constant shift between conservative and liberal based on how many justices are appointed by which party and exactly how conservative or how liberal some of those justices can be, really shifts how they decide on things like the 14th Amendment and due process and incorporation. And the political makeup of the Supreme Court is an important thing. So I would encourage you, if you're watching this video, go look up what's going on in the Supreme Court today. How many justices were appointed by Republicans? How many justices were appointed by Democrats? Is there an open seat? Who's the current president? Who do you think they might appoint if a seat becomes open? It's a very, very big deal. The Supreme Court has more influence on you as an American citizen than probably anybody else in the country. I would say they have more impact on you than the president does. Okay? The Supreme Court is incredibly, incredibly important. Pay attention to it. I also want to note something about the presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence is kind of one of those misunderstood things because I think the media does a pretty terrible job educating people about what the presumption of innocence really means, right? So when we say that people are presumed innocent until proven guilty, does that mean we're not allowed to treat them any differently until we get that guilty verdict? No, of course we can treat people differently long before they get the guilty verdict. Think about it. If we couldn't treat people differently or do different things or violate or suspend their rights temporarily, we couldn't have arrests. I mean, think about it. What is an arrest but a removal of your right to go as you want and do as you please prior to you being proven guilty, right? So the presumption of innocence isn't about how we can't treat you any differently until we find a guilty verdict. No. The presumption of innocence just means that it is the requirement of the prosecution to prove that you are guilty. Okay? It is not a requirement of the defendant to prove that they are innocent. No person in the history of American court jurisprudence has ever been found innocent of a crime. They are found either guilty or not guilty, because it is the job and the responsibility of the prosecution to prove that they are guilty. Okay? It is not the job or the requirement or the demand of the defense to show that he is innocent. Does that make sense? So that presumption of innocence is just about who has the burden of proof in a trial. All right? Now, finally, one last note. As we finish section 1, I just want to talk very, very briefly about the evolution of criminal justice as an academic major. Okay? So way back in the day, it started off with sociology. And sociology, as the name might suggest, is the study of society. How societies interact, how people interact in large groups, how people get along or don't get along. A subset of that field became criminology. And this really, really took off in the 1930s. Okay, that's when Merton was around, John Mackay, and all these different people started coming up with, essentially, that is the sociological study of why do people commit crime, right? And most universities, if you're a criminal justice major, you have to take an entire course that's just called either criminology or criminological theory, which is just an entire semester of trying to answer that question. Why do people commit crime? And it's a very interesting thing, and people studied that for a long time as a subfield of criminology, or as a subfield of sociology, I should say. Then in the 60s and 70s, we started having a separation between criminology, which is this kind of theoretical, sociological study of crime, towards criminal justice. And criminal justice is a much more kind of applied, mathematic, quantifiable research kind of of area, right? So in criminology, you might talk about the theories of why people commit crime. In criminal justice, you might talk about how changing police patrol strategies can reduce bar fights in certain college towns, right? So it's a much more applied, the name suggests a much more applied field than just criminology. And so there are some departments around universities around the country where they just have a criminology major, which is in the sociology department. A lot of universities have moved towards having a criminal justice as its own separate field, distinct from sociology. But criminal justice is still a growing field, okay? Which is good for people like me, makes it easier for us to find jobs. So criminal justice is growing, but it's also creating its own subfields, right? So sociology created the subfield of criminology. Criminal justice is now creating its own subfields. So like my particular subfield is cybercrime and digital forensics, which is a vastly different subfield than a lot of other people in the criminal justice field might have, right? So other people in criminal justice might specifically study, say, policing, right? Or they might specifically study, how race and the criminal justice system interact, right? There are lots of different subfields within criminal justice, and if you are a criminal justice major, I would advise you to find your own. Find which one really interests you, and it's going to be different for everybody, right? But criminal justice is a really cool, really interesting blend of a lot of different fields. I really like it because it's a little bit law, and it's a little bit psychology, and it's a little bit technology, and it's a little bit sociology and anthropology, and it brings in all these wide, disparate fields and puts them all together to study this one particular social phenomena that is endemic to humanity. And it's this amazing, wonderful blend of all these different things that all come together to really study something that is incredibly important. But anyway, that ends section 1. Thank you so much for watching. I will be back with section 2 soon.